On September 26, 2024, the state of Oklahoma executed a man for a murder no court could ever prove he personally committed. No DNA, no clear weapon, no single witness who could say without hesitation, "I saw him pull the trigger." Yet after more than 3 decades on death row, Emmanuel Littlejohn was put to death anyway. And the question that has haunted this case from the very beginning still hasn't gone away. Did the state execute the right man, or just the most convenient one? Because once you look closely at what happened inside that convenience store in 1992, the story becomes far more complicated than the verdict ever suggested. June 19, 1992, started like any other Friday night in Oklahoma City. Kenneth Meers, just 31 years old, was behind the counter of the convenience store he co-owned. He wasn't just a store owner. People in the neighborhood knew him as someone who helped when others were short on cash, someone who cared. That night, 2 employees were working alongside him. Nothing felt unusual, no warning signs, no sense that within minutes, everything would be over. At around 10:15 p.m., 2 men walked through the door. They were armed, they were desperate, and they were looking for fast money. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The men held Meers at gunpoint. A robbery was underway, and then one gunshot rang out. Meers was struck in the face. The 2 men ran. The store fell silent, and Kenneth Meers was left dying on the floor. Witnesses were everywhere, inside the store, outside the store. People saw the aftermath. People saw the men flee. But when police began asking the most important question, who fired the shot, the answers didn't line up. And that single uncertainty would follow this case for the next 32 years. Because from that moment on, everything depended on identifying one trigger pull. Police quickly zeroed in on 2 men, Emmanuel Littlejohn and Glenn Bethany. Both were young, both were broke, and both reportedly owed money to a local drug dealer. According to investigators, the robbery wasn't carefully planned. It was rushed, reckless, and driven by panic. But when it came to the shooting itself, the story fractured almost immediately. Inside the store, one employee said he saw Littlejohn holding Meers at gunpoint. He claimed he never saw Bethany with a weapon. Outside the store, other witnesses told a different story. They described the shooter as the taller of the 2 men. Bethany was significantly taller than Littlejohn. He also had a darker complexion, a detail some witnesses emphasized. And here's the part that would haunt the case. No physical evidence ever proved which man fired the fatal shot. No fingerprints on the weapon, no ballistic evidence tied to one suspect, no confession from either man. Yet both were arrested, Bethany almost immediately, Littlejohn after 5 days on the run. From the start, both pointed fingers at each other. And from the start, the justice system chose not to resolve that contradiction, but to work around it. And that choice would change everything. Glenn Bethany went to trial first in 1993. The jury found him guilty of robbery and murder. Prosecutors pushed for the ultimate punishment, but when sentencing came, the jury stopped short. Bethany was spared. Life without parole, no execution date, no death row, no lethal injection. 1 year later, it was Emmanuel Littlejohn's turn. By then, the narrative had shifted. Prosecutors argued more aggressively that Littlejohn was the shooter. Littlejohn admitted his role in the robbery, but drew a hard line there. He said he didn't pull the trigger. He said Bethany did. Bethany, now already serving life, backed the prosecution's version. He claimed Littlejohn fired the shot. The jury sided with the state. In November 1994, Emmanuel Littlejohn was convicted. 3 days later, after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury sentenced him to death. Bethany would live. Littlejohn would die. And from that moment forward, the case stopped being about what happened and became about whether doubt mattered at all. Littlejohn entered death row in his early 20s. He would leave it in his 50s. Over the next 3 decades, he appealed again and again, never changing his central claim: "I took part in the robbery, but I did not kill Kenneth Meers." At one point, Oklahoma's highest criminal court agreed something wasn't right, at least procedurally. In 1998, his death sentence was thrown out, not because he was innocent, but because the jury needed to reconsider aggravating factors. 2 years later, another jury resentenced him to death. Appeals followed. Federal courts weighed in. Arguments about inconsistent prosecution theory surfaced. Littlejohn's lawyers pointed out that the same prosecutor handled both trials and appeared to suggest different shooters depending on which defendant was on trial. Courts rejected the argument. By 2018, Littlejohn had exhausted every legal path. His execution was no longer a question of if, only when. And that's when public attention returned to a case most people had forgotten. As Oklahoma prepared to resume executions, activists began looking closely at Littlejohn's case. Not because they claimed to know he was innocent, but because they argued the state could not be certain he was guilty enough to execute. Religious leaders stepped in. Anti-death penalty groups spoke out. The argument was simple. If 2 men committed the crime and the shooter was never conclusively identified, should one man die while the other lives? At his clemency hearing, Littlejohn spoke directly to the board. He admitted responsibility for the robbery. He expressed remorse. He apologized to Meers' family, but he did not admit to firing the fatal shot. His mother pleaded for mercy. She told the board how her life had changed, how she had battled addiction, how losing her only son would destroy what she had rebuilt. Then the Meers family spoke. They described Kenneth as kind, generous, and community-minded, a man who helped kids at Christmas, a man who never deserved what happened to him. After hours of testimony, the parole board voted 3-2 in favor of clemency. It was a stunning moment, but the board's recommendation wasn't final. The last decision belonged to one man, Governor Kevin Stitt. As execution day approached, tension climbed. Supporters believed the board's recommendation meant something. After all, Stitt had granted clemency once before, but history wasn't on Littlejohn's side. Appeals were filed, denied. Federal courts declined to intervene. The state moved forward with preparations anyway. Littlejohn said goodbye to his family. He spoke with his daughter. He met his granddaughter. He ate his final meal, and still no decision from the governor. Then, on the morning of September 26, 2024, just hours before the execution, Governor Stitt announced his choice: clemency denied. He said the jury had spoken, the courts had affirmed, and as a law and order governor, he would not override that process. Littlejohn had hours left to live. At Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Emmanuel Littlejohn was strapped to a gurney. The drugs flowed. Witnesses reported his final words were directed not toward anger or protest, but reassurance. "Everything is going to be okay. I love you." At 10:17 a.m., he was pronounced dead. The state called it justice. Activists called it irreversible harm. The Meers family issued a statement thanking authorities for closure. Abolitionists criticized the timing and emotional toll of last-minute decisions. And quietly, the central question resurfaced once more. Because Glenn Bethany, the other man at the scene, remains alive. 2 men walked into that store. One man fired a gun. No court ever proved who, yet only one paid with his life. Emmanuel Littlejohn's execution didn't resolve that contradiction, it sealed it. And whether you believe justice was served or doubt should have mattered more, one truth remains impossible to ignore. When the punishment is final, uncertainty doesn't disappear, it echoes. And long after the execution chamber goes quiet, the question still lingers, unanswered, unresolved, and unsettling. What if the state got it wrong?